The Galactic Council had been fighting the Vorthak Empire for 17 standard cycles. 17. Can you believe that? 17 years of glorious warfare, strategic brilliance, and absolutely nothing to show for it except a few trillion dead soldiers and enough debt to bankrupt 3-star systems. Oh, and let's not forget the countless tactical retreats that somehow always seem to involve running away very, very fast. My name is Crix9, and I'm what you might call a war correspondent, though survivor with a really expensive recording device might be more accurate at this point. I've been covering this conflict since the beginning, back when everyone thought it would be over in 6 months. Hey, if I had a credit for every time some pompous admiral said victory is within our grasp, I could buy my own planet. A nice one, with beaches and those little drinks with the tiny umbrellas. The Vorthak were nasty pieces of work. I'll give them that much. 8-foot-tall insectoid nightmares with acid for blood and a charming habit of eating their prisoners alive. They'd swept through the Outer Rim territories like a plague of really angry locusts, consuming entire colonies and turning peaceful farming worlds into ash-covered graveyards. Their ships looked like someone had taken a spider, made it the size of a city, and then covered it in weapons that could crack moons in half. The Council's response: form a committee. Then form a subcommittee to discuss the first committee. Then hold 17 different hearings about whether they should possibly, perhaps consider doing something about the giant bug monsters eating everyone. Politicians. Am I right? By the time they actually decided to fight back, the Vorthak had already claimed half the galaxy. But hey, at least the paperwork was in order. Commander Yalix of the Zentorian Defense Force was one of the few military leaders who actually seemed to understand that wars aren't won by filing the correct forms in a triplicate. Tall, blue-skinned, and with enough cybernetic implants to make a repair droid jealous, she'd been pushing for aggressive action since day one. Unfortunately, aggressive action requires aggressive funding, and the Council was about as generous with their military budget as a Ferengi at a charity auction. We need more ships, Yalix had told the Council for the 1000th time during their latest strategy session. I was there, recording everything for posterity. And by posterity, I mean the insurance companies who were going to want detailed records of exactly how spectacularly this whole thing went wrong. Ships cost money, replied Counselor Vex, a slug-like creature whose idea of tactical thinking involved hiding under his desk whenever someone mentioned actual combat. Perhaps we could negotiate with them, offer them some of the outer colonies in exchange for peace? The silence that followed was so profound, you could have heard a pin drop in the vacuum of space. Yalix's expression suggested she was seriously considering whether strangling a council member would count as treason or public service. Counselor, she said with the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining quantum physics to houseplants, they eat people for fun. They're not interested in negotiations unless it involves discussing which seasoning goes best with roasted Zentorian. That's when the news arrived that changed everything. A junior communications officer, barely old enough to operate the coffee machine without adult supervision, it burst into the chamber with the kind of excitement that usually preceded either great victories or spectacular disasters. Sirs, madams, various other honorifics. He gasped, waving a data pad like it contained the secrets of the universe. We've received a transmission from the Sol system. The humans want to join the war effort. The collective reaction was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly what you'd call enthusiastic. A few council members actually laughed. Counselor Vex made a sound that I can only describe as a cross between a snort and the noise a deflating balloon makes. The humans? Laughed Counselor Morks, whose own species had contributed exactly 3 outdated patrol boats to the war effort. What are they going to do? Bore the Vorthak to death with their primitive technology. Now, I should probably explain something about humans at this point. See, most of the galaxy knew about Earth, but nobody really took them seriously. They were what we politely called a developing civilization, which is diplomatic speak for barely smart enough to tie their own shoes without causing a galactic incident. The humans had only achieved faster than light travel about 50 years ago, and their first contact with the galactic community had been, well, let's call it memorable. Their initial diplomatic message had been transmitted on what they called radio waves, which was roughly equivalent to communicating by banging rocks together. They'd sent mathematical sequences, pictures of their anatomy, and for some inexplicable reason, a recording of something called Never Gonna Give You Up by someone named Rick Astley. It took the xenolinguistics department 3 months to figure out that the song wasn't some kind of war declaration. Their technology was hilariously primitive by galactic standards. While the rest of us had energy shields that could stop a supernova, the humans were still using something called armor, actual physical barriers made of metal and ceramic. It was like watching cavemen try to fight starships with pointy sticks. But here's the thing about humans that nobody in the council seemed to understand. They were absolutely, completely, utterly insane. And I mean that in the most terrifying way possible. Take their military history, for example. These creatures had spent most of their existence finding increasingly creative ways to kill each other. They'd gone from hitting each other with rocks to splitting atoms in the span of a few thousand years. They'd fought wars in trenches filled with poison gas. They'd dropped suns on their own cities, and they'd somehow convinced themselves that mutually assured destruction was a reasonable military strategy. And then there were their recreational activities. Humans, for reasons that no xenopsychologist had ever been able to explain, actually enjoyed putting themselves in mortal danger for fun. They threw themselves out of perfectly good aircraft. They climbed mountains that were actively trying to kill them. And they had something called extreme sports, which seemed to involve finding the most dangerous possible way to travel from point A to point B. Most species developed space travel to explore the cosmos and seek out new life and new civilizations. Humans developed it because they'd run out of dangerous things to do on their own planet. Commander Yalix, unlike the rest of the council, had actually bothered to read the intelligence reports on human military capabilities. Her expression was thoughtful. "What exactly are the humans offering?" she asked. The communications officer consulted his datapad. "They're requesting permission to send their entire space fleet to assist with the war effort. According to their message, they can be here within 72 standard hours. Their entire fleet." Morks was practically giggling now. "All 12 ships?" "Actually, sir." The officer cleared his throat nervously. "According to this, it's 347 vessels." The laughter stopped. Even I had to double-check my recording equipment to make sure I'd heard that correctly. "That can't be right," Vex spluttered. Our intelligence reports indicated they had barely a dozen interstellar-capable ships. "Well, sir," the officer was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Those reports are from 5 years ago. According to this transmission, they've been busy." Yalix leaned forward, her cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on the datapad. "What class of vessels are we talking about?" "A unknown, ma'am. Their ship classifications don't match anything in our databases. They're using terms like dreadnought, battlecruiser, and something called a carrier. Also, they keep mentioning something called Marines." The council exchanged glances. None of us had ever heard of Marines. It sounded vaguely aquatic. "Are they some kind of amphibious assault force?" asked Morks. I couldn't help but snort. If only they knew. Yalix stood up, her decision apparently made. "We accept their offer. Send a reply immediately." "Commander." Vex's voice carried the tone of someone who was about to make a monumentally stupid observation. "Are you certain this is wise? We know virtually nothing about human military doctrine or capabilities." "Counselor," Yalix replied with a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring but looked more like a predator sizing up its next meal. "At this point, we're losing so badly that even if the humans show up and immediately surrender to the Vorthak, it won't make our situation any worse." Or to argue with that logic. The transmission was sent, and the reply came back within minutes. Just 4 words: "On our way. Stay alive." Somehow, the way they said it made it sound less like encouragement and more like a threat. 71 hours and 37 minutes later, the humans arrived. Now, I've seen a lot of space fleets in my time. I've watched the majestic Arcturus battle groups glide through space like graceful swans made of metal and death. I've witnessed the geometric perfection of Zentaurian formations, each ship precisely positioned in mathematical harmony. I've even seen the chaotic swarms of Klingon raiders, beautiful in their own terrifying way. Nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared me for the human fleet. They didn't arrive. They erupted into reality like some kind of cosmic hemorrhage, their ships dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation with a precision that made our best navigators look like they'd learned to fly by crashing into things repeatedly. Their vessels were wrong. That's the only way I can describe them. Or every other species in the galaxy had learned to build ships that were elegant, efficient, and aesthetically pleasing. The humans had apparently decided that their ships should look like someone had taken a city-sized brick and covered it in gun turrets. The lead ship, and I use the term ship loosely, because it was more like a flying fortress that had eaten several smaller fortresses, was easily the largest vessel I'd ever seen. It dwarfed even the Council's flagship, and that thing was big enough to have its own weather patterns. "This is Admiral Sarah Martinez of the U.S. Retribution, requesting permission to assume fleet command," came the transmission. The voice was crisp, professional, and carried just a hint of an accent that our translation computers couldn't quite identify. Commander Yalix looked like someone had just handed her the keys to the universe. "Permission granted, Admiral. We're transmitting all tactical data now, received and acknowledged. Analysis complete. We'll take it from here." Analysis complete. They'd been in system for less than 10 minutes. It had taken our strategists 6 months to analyze the same data, and they'd needed 3 different committees and a consulting fee that could have funded a small war. "Admiral," Yalix said carefully, "our intelligence indicates that the Vortak have approximately 4,000 ships in this sector, including several Dreadnought-class vessels. Our current forces are heavily outnumbered." There was a pause. Then something that might have been laughter. "Ma'am, with respect, I don't think you understand. We're not here to even the odds. We're here to end this," and that's when the real show began. What happened next will probably be studied in military academies across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. Assuming there are any military academies left after everyone realizes how monumentally stupid the rest of us had been. The human fleet didn't waste time with elaborate battle formations or lengthy tactical discussions. They didn't request detailed briefings on Vortak weaknesses or ask for our blessing on their strategy. They simply moved. And by moved, I mean they accelerated toward the Vortak positions like they were late for the universe's most important appointment. Their ships formed into groups that our computers couldn't identify, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things, and yet maintained perfect coordination across hundreds of vessels. "Admiral Martinez," Yalix transmitted, her voice tight with concern, "the Vortak fleet is moving to intercept. Their formation suggests they're preparing for a standard engagement pattern." "Understood," came the reply. "All units execute Protocol 7. Time to introduction. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. Protocol 7? Introduction. What kind of military speaks in riddles?" I was about to find out. The Vortak fleet was impressive. I'll give them that. 4,000 ships arranged in their classic web formation, designed to ensnare and destroy any fleet foolish enough to challenge them. Their flagship, the Devourer of Worlds, was a massive biomechanical nightmare that looked like something from a fever dream. It had personally destroyed 17 Council battle groups over the past 3 years. The humans approached this terrifying armada like they were heading to a particularly boring business meeting. "Contact in 60 seconds, announced someone from the human fleet. "Weapons hot. All Marines to deployment stations," or Marines again. I was starting to think these weren't aquatic creatures after all. The first exchange of fire was educational. The Vortak opened up with their signature weapon. Bioplasma cannons that could melt through our best shields like they were made of soap. Streams of green death lanced out toward the human ships, each blast carrying enough energy to vaporize a small moon. The humans didn't dodge. They didn't even slow down. Instead, their ships simply absorbed the hits. Shield systems that our sensors couldn't even detect deflected the plasma streams like they were particularly aggressive raindrops. A few of the smaller human vessels actually seemed to glow brighter after being hit, as if they were somehow feeding off the energy. "That's impossible," breathed Yalix. Nothing can withstand concentrated bioplasma fire. Admiral Martinez, I found myself transmitting before I could stop myself. How are your shields holding up to that bombardment? There was a brief pause. Shields? Oh, those aren't shields. That's just our hull plating. We figured if we're going to get shot at, we might as well make sure it doesn't actually hurt. Hull plating. They were taking direct hits from weapons that could crack planets, and they were calling it hull plating. The human return fire was, well, calling it overkill would be like calling a supernova mildly warm. Instead of the elegant energy beams or sophisticated particle weapons that civilized species used, the humans had apparently decided that the best way to solve their problems was to throw really, really big pieces of metal at them. Really fast. Their kinetic bombardment turned the first wave of Vorthak ships into expanding clouds of superheated debris. Each human vessel seemed to carry enough firepower to level continents, and they used it with the casual efficiency of someone swatting flies. But it was what happened next that made me realize we weren't just witnessing a battle. We were watching the galaxy's understanding of warfare get completely rewritten. Boarding teams away, announced Admiral Martinez. Boarding teams? In the middle of a space battle? That was suicide. You don't board enemy ships when you're outnumbered 4-1 and surrounded by hostile fire. It simply isn't done. Betch, nobody had told the humans that, apparently. Small craft began launching from the human ships, thousands of them. They looked like armored bullets with engines, streaking toward the Vorthak fleet at speeds that should have turned their occupants into paste. Our sensors tracked them as they punched through defensive fire that would have vaporized our best fighters, and then they started cutting their way into Vorthak ships. This is insane, muttered Counselor Vex. They're going to get themselves killed. 5 minutes later, Vorthak ships began exploding from the inside. Not the clean, efficient destruction of weapons fire. These were the messy, chaotic explosions that happen when someone gets inside your ship and starts breaking important things. One by one, massive Vorthak vessels simply came apart as their own systems turned against them. Status report, requested Yalix, boarding operations proceeding ahead of schedule. Came the reply from a voice that wasn't Admiral Martinez. This one was younger, male, and had the kind of cheerful enthusiasm usually associated with people who were having way too much fun. X7 secured. Moving to engineering. Hey, did you guys know these bug things taste like chicken? They were eating the enemy while fighting them. I made a note to never get on humanity's bad side. The Vorthak fleet, which had spent 17 years proving that they were the galaxy's ultimate predators, suddenly found themselves on the wrong end of the food chain. Their tactical doctrine, based on fear and overwhelming force, completely collapsed when faced with an enemy that seemed to consider mortal combat a recreational activity. Ships that had terrorized entire star systems began to retreat. The mighty Devourer of Worlds, flagship of the Vorthak Empire, turned tail and ran like a scared child when 3 human vessels started moving in its direction. It didn't get far. The humans had brought something they called a planet cracker, a ship that was less vessel and more weaponized physics experiment. When it fired, reality seemed to hiccup. The Devourer of Worlds simply ceased to exist, along with a roughly spherical chunk of space around it. What was that? Yalix's voice was barely a whisper. Experimental gravity weapon. Admiral Martinez replied casually, we're still working out the bugs. Sometimes it makes black holes instead of just deleting things. Engineering says they'll have it figured out by next Tuesday. They had experimental weapons that accidentally created black holes, and they were using them in combat because they were bored on weekends. The battle, if you could still call it that, lasted exactly 4 hours and 57 minutes. By the end, the Vorthak fleet had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris and a few dozen ships that were retreating so fast they were probably violating several laws of physics. But the humans weren't done. Admiral, Yalix transmitted, the surviving Vorthak forces are withdrawing to their fortress systems. Our intelligence suggests they have extensive defensive networks there. Ready on it, Martinez replied. Fleet elements Alpha through Gamma are moving to intercept. We should have their homeworld secured within 48 hours. Secured? They were talking about invading the Vorthak homeworld, the same homeworld that was protected by orbital defense platforms that could destroy star systems. I found myself saying, the Vorthak home system has never been successfully attacked. Their defenses are impregnable. Yeah, we saw the intelligence reports, came a new voice, female, with an accent that made every word sound like a challenge. Looks like they put all their defensive platforms in orbit around their planet. That's adorable. It's like they've never heard of orbital bombardment. 43 hours later, I received a transmission from the Vorthak homeworld. It was a surrender document, written in 17 different languages, formally requesting terms for the complete and unconditional capitulation of the Vorthak Empire. The war was over. 17 years of galactic conflict, trillions of casualties, entire civilizations brought to the brink of extinction, and the humans had ended it in less than 2 days. They'd done what the combined might of the Galactic Council couldn't accomplish in nearly 2 decades, and they'd made it look easy. The aftermath was interesting. Admiral Martinez accepted the Vorthak's surrender with the kind of professional courtesy usually reserved for business negotiations. She didn't gloat, didn't make demands for territory or resources, didn't even ask for reparations. She simply accepted their surrender, established a few basic rules about not eating people anymore, and then asked if anyone wanted coffee. Coffee, it turned out, was a mildly addictive stimulant that humans consumed in vast quantities. They offered to share. So, I asked Martinez during the post-battle debriefing, what happens now? Are you going to establish a human protectorate, claim territory, set up trade agreements? She looked genuinely confused by the question. Why would we do that? We came here to help with your bug problem. Problem solved. We'll probably head home next week unless you need anything else fixed. She was talking about a galactic war like it was a broken appliance. But surely, Counselor Vex interjected, humanity expects some form of compensation for your assistance. Martinez exchanged glances with her officers. Several of them were trying not to laugh. Well, she said finally, if you happen to have any good recipes, we'd appreciate them. And maybe some of those little umbrellas for drinks. Our bartenders have been asking about those. They'd ended a 17-year war in 5 hours, and all they wanted in return were cocktail umbrellas. As I write this report, 3 months after the end of the Vorthak War, I'm still trying to process what I witnessed. The humans have kept their word. They've gone home, leaving behind only a small diplomatic mission and a few technical advisors who are helping us upgrade our defensive systems. They've shared some of their technology, though they insist on calling it obsolete stuff we were going to throw away anyway. This obsolete technology is roughly 1,000 years more advanced than anything the rest of the galaxy has ever seen. They've also shared their cultural exports. Human entertainment, it turns out, is almost as terrifying as their military. They have something called action movies that make our most violent gladiatorial games look like children's puppet shows. And don't get me started on their music. They have entire genres dedicated to angry people shouting about their feelings. But perhaps most disturbing of all, they've started teaching other species their military tactics, not the advanced stuff. They say we're not ready for the fun weapons yet, but basic human strategic thinking. The results have been dramatic. The pirate confederation of Zirion, which had been a persistent nuisance for centuries, surrendered after 3 council species implemented something called aggressive negotiation. The Stellar Republic's border disputes were resolved when both sides realized that humans were offering to mediate the conflict. Nobody wanted to find out what human mediation looked like. I've spent my career covering wars, conflicts, and military actions across the galaxy. I thought I understood violence, strategy, and the nature of warfare itself. I was wrong. Yeah, humans don't fight wars. They solve problems violently, efficiently, and with a disturbing level of enthusiasm, but they solve them nonetheless. They don't see enemies. They see obstacles to be removed. They don't strategize for victory. They engineer solutions, and the most terrifying part, they're trying to be helpful. You know, Admiral Martinez told me during our final interview, you guys have a lot of potential. Your technology is pretty good, your people are smart. And you've got some nice planets. You just need to think bigger. Bigger? Well, sure. I mean, you've been fighting the same war for 17 years. Back home, we would have wrapped that up over a long weekend and still had time for a barbecue. She said this like it was perfectly reasonable. As the human diplomatic mission prepared to leave, I asked Martinez one final question. What would you have done if the Vortak had been stronger? If they'd actually posed a threat to your fleet? She thought about it for a moment, then smiled. It was the kind of smile that suggested I really didn't want to know the answer. Well, she said, we probably would have had to get creative. I'm told that humans consider creativity a virtue. The galaxy may never recover,